Good morning. I'm going to start off today with a little confession about my life. My habit each day at the end of my day before I go to bed at night is to read the comics section of the Dallas Morning News. Now, some of you are going to think that's strange because I've been accused of a man who has no sense of humor or even smiles very much. But occasionally when I'm there in the comic section, there is another section there called the advice columns. You have your Dear Abbeys, and I guess my favorite might be Miss Manners. To be honest, sometimes as I read those columns, they're more comical than the comic strips that I read. But often I find myself being sad that the people that bring those problems to those ladies in the Dallas Morning News, that this is the only outlet they have for wisdom and advice in their life. It got me thinking about, where do I go for advice? Where do I go to get answers for the issues and problems that I have? I can Google just about anything now and get facts and information and data about a lot of things. But where do I go for the real problems of life? Where can I get advice for the issues about relationships and life and struggles that I have? There's no place that I need to be more than here in God's Word. And so over these next few weeks, Jeff and Kevin and I will be bringing you some thoughts out of the book of Proverbs, the book about wisdom, written by the wisest man who ever lived, Solomon, the book of Proverbs. Now I'm going to start off this morning reading to you from chapter 1, verses 1 through 7. It says, "The proverb of Solomon, the son of David, the king of Israel, to know wisdom and instruction, to understand words of insight, to receive instruction in wise dealing, in righteousness and justice and equity, to give prudence to the simple and knowledge and discretion to our youth. Let the wise hear and increase in learning. Let the one who understands obtain guidance. To understand a proverb and a saying, the words of these wise that are wise and these riddles, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, and fools despise wisdom and instruction." Psalm 111 also says that the fear of God is the beginning of wisdom. You know, there's a big difference between what my granddad called book smarts and wisdom, between having a lot of facts and information and then being able to use those facts, use that knowledge for good purposes and to have good relationships and to live a happy and contented life. And for us who are disciples of Jesus Christ, it is so important that we be able to take the knowledge and the voices that we hear into our lives and run those through the filter of God's wisdom so that we can be a light into this world. Solomon learned this lesson, and now he teaches this lesson to us. The fear, the respect, the acknowledgement that God is on his throne is where all wisdom begins. Solomon goes on in verse 8 and 9 and says, "Hear, my son, your father's instruction, and forsake not your mother's teaching, for they are a graceful garland around your head and a pendant for your neck." I love that, a very, very beautiful word picture about the advice and the wisdom that we get from our moms and dads. Now that I'm a dad and now that I'm a granddad, we all know how that works. I heard somebody describe a couple of weeks ago that wisdom are all those things that our parents taught us when we were teenagers and yet we didn't do them. And now we're reteaching those same things to our kids and they're probably not going to do them either. But that's the idea about wisdom. It's interesting to think about how lessons of our parents are meaningful to us and how they got the wisdom that they got. Many of our parents have been through so many things in their life: wars and depression and recessions, struggles, social revolution, technology revolutions, and they seem to weather those storms pretty well. My dad in particular is especially a guy who's not rattled by much. And I would tell you it's because he runs just about everything in his life through the filter of God's word and God's wisdom. That approach is really what Solomon is calling us to do. In verses 10 through 19, Solomon, in very plain language, says there are people out there, there are voices out there that we don't need to listen to. And a matter of fact, he actually ends up calling a lot of those voices sinful people and sinful behavior. In verse 10, he says this, "My son, if sinners entice you, do not consent to them." In verse 13, he says, "We shall find all precious goods and shall fill our houses with plunder. Throw in among our lots and we will all have one purse. My son, do not walk in the way of them. Hold back your feet from their path, for their feet run to evil, and they make haste to shed blood." There's a lot of things in this first proverb that are so meaningful to us today. As you read the rest of this chapter today in your home, you'll see that Solomon paints a pretty plain picture of whose voices we need to be listening to. And most of them center around people who have relationships with God, and people without God are the ones that we don't need to be listening to. I want you to think a little bit today about the different voices that speak into your life and into my life. We live in what was called the information age, 24-hour news channels, social media, tweets and Twitters, good news, bad news, and even fake news. Then there's the entertainment industry with their moral values or lack thereof that are constantly before us, our ears and our eyes. Their priorities of chasing after the wrong things, worldly priorities. I want you to think today about all the different voices that speak into your life and ask yourself, how many of those voices come from God? And how many of those that speak in our lives are not from God? As you read in verses 20 through 32, God, again in very plain language, says that if you ignore my wisdom, there will be consequences. The consequences are dramatic and unpleasant, for sure. But God says if the world continues to ignore me, if the world continues to follow their own wisdom and ways, and especially if God's people start ignoring God's wisdom, things will get hard. God will allow them to suffer consequences and following their own ways instead of his ways. Well, that's not a very pleasant thought for us to end on today, but the last verse in Proverbs 1 is very encouraging to me, and I want to share that with you. And it starts off with a very important word, and that word is but, B-U-T. Proverbs 1, verse 33. But whoever listens to me and will dwell secure and will be at ease without dread of harm. If we embrace him, if we follow him, if we turn back to him, God is always willing to accept and forgive and be with us. And that's our bumper sticker. That's our t-shirt for these days of uncertainty. God's people dwell secure. We are at ease. We are without dread or fear. And when our world seems darkest, that's when light has its most impact. As followers of God, this is our time to be the church. This is our time to display calm and the certainty of our relationship with God and his wisdom and not the world's wisdom. We take all the information being given to us today and we run it through this filter of God's word and God's wisdom, and we'll be just fine. A good friend of mine told me years ago that even in the storms of life, and maybe especially in the storms of life, God is there and at work. And then this friend said, sometimes God calms the storm, and sometimes he calms his children. Well, I invite all of us to be in prayer that this storm of this virus will pass soon. Until then, God has given us his word and his church to help us be calm, and his children to be calm. And I believe it's an opportunity for us to shine in the world this calm and this reason for our calmness with the rest of the world. I want to close with a passage about what Paul says about wisdom in 2 Corinthians 1, verse 12. Now this is our boast. Our conscience testifies that we have conducted ourselves in this world, and especially in our relationships with you, with integrity and with godly sincerity. We have done so relying not on our worldly wisdom, but on God's grace. That's us. That's our charge. Live with integrity, embrace God's grace, and share it with the world in this time of trouble. Thank you so much for your attention today.